My name is Emily, and I have always found comfort in rainy nights. The sense of isolation that the rain brings usually calms me, and that night was no different. I was alone at home, trying to lose myself in the pages of a book while listening to the rhythmic sound of the drops hitting the windows. Wrapped in a blanket, I felt the cozy warmth of the fireplace in front of me. The house was quiet, and the only company I had was the soft crackling of the fire, something that usually brought me peace. As the storm outside gained strength, the sound of the rain increased, creating a constant music that filled the silence of the house. I loved the sound of rain. It always brought me a sense of peace and introspection. However, that night seemed different, as if the storm itself was bringing something darker with it. I tried to dismiss that thought, focusing again on the book in my hands. Despite the weather, my mind continued to wander, scattered between the lines of the book and the reality around me. The shadows cast by the flames of the fireplace danced on the walls, creating fleeting shapes that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. That should have been comforting, but at that moment, I felt a growing restlessness within me, a difficult-to-explain sensation. With every page I turned, my focus was divided between the words and the sounds of the house. There was something in the air, something I couldn't identify, but it persisted in lingering on the periphery of my thoughts. Maybe it was just the isolation of the night, amplified by the storm, or maybe something more was creeping into my mind. Either way, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was about to happen. Even as I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the feeling of restlessness did not diminish. It was as if the house was whispering to me, trying to alert me to something I still couldn't see. But, with the book in hand and the sound of the rain around me, I forced myself to ignore these thoughts, believing the night would unfold like any other. Little did I know that I was about to face something much more disturbing. It was in the midst of this attempt at concentration that I heard the first sound, a faint noise coming from upstairs. At first, I didn't pay much attention, convinced it was just the house settling. Old houses tend to creak and crack with temperature changes, especially on rainy nights like that one. I returned my attention to the book, trying to immerse myself in the story again. However, the sound didn't stop. On the contrary, it became clearer and more distinct. Now it seemed like soft footsteps were moving across the floor above me. My body tensed, and my heart began to beat faster. I paused my reading and focused on the sounds, hoping they would stop, but they continued, becoming more evident as if someone was really walking upstairs. Doubt began to set in my mind. I knew I was alone at home, having checked the doors before settling down. But the intensity and regularity of the footsteps were hard to ignore. The stories I was reading began to blend with reality, creating confusion in my mind. Yet I tried to convince myself it was just the noise of the house, an old structure reacting to the storm. The footsteps, however, continued, becoming more firm, moving across the upstairs floor from one side to the other. The feeling that something wasn't right took over me. I could no longer concentrate on the book. My eyes roamed the room expecting to see something out of place, but everything looked normal, except for the footsteps that now seemed undeniable. Finally, I set the book aside, the sound of the footsteps becoming impossible to ignore. Something inside me said I needed to investigate, but the idea of going upstairs on that dark, rainy night filled me with dread. Yet I knew I couldn't just sit there without finding out the source of those sounds. With my heart racing, I stood up from the couch, trying to gather courage to go up and face whatever was there. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my feet, as if the house itself was trying to stop me from continuing. The flashlight in my hand trembled slightly, reflecting my growing anxiety. The silence was almost oppressive, interrupted only by the sound of my breathing and the steps under my feet. Each step I took led me deeper into the darkness of the upstairs where the footsteps had originated. When I finally reached the top of the stairs, I paused for a moment to listen. Silence reigned again, as if the footsteps had ceased the moment I began to investigate. This sudden quiet only increased my discomfort, making me feel even more exposed and vulnerable. I decided to start searching the main bedroom, which was at the end of the hallway. I opened the door slowly, expecting to find something out of the ordinary, but everything looked exactly as I had left it. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, and no sign that anyone had been there. I used the flashlight to check each corner, but there was nothing, no indication that the footsteps were real. Yet the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Leaving the main bedroom, I went towards the second bedroom and the bathroom, repeating the same process. In every place, I found only the normality of a house where no one should be, but the doubt still lingered, along with a growing sensation that something was wrong. Each room seemed colder and darker, as if the house itself was trying to hide something from me. After checking all the rooms upstairs and finding nothing, I began to question my sanity. Perhaps it was just nerves, exacerbated by the storm and the isolation. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't dispel the feeling that something was happening. Nevertheless, I decided to go back downstairs, hoping that the sounds would stop and I could regain my peace. I descended the stairs with the same care, trying to calm my racing heart and convince myself that everything was fine. The downstairs seemed even more welcoming after my foray into the dark upstairs. The warmth of the fireplace still filled the room, and the sound of the rain continued. But now it seemed more distant, almost muffled by the tension I felt. I sat down again on the couch, trying to resume reading and forget what had happened. For a few minutes, I managed to convince myself that the sounds were just my imagination, perhaps the result of a too engaging book read in a setting conducive to fear. But as I tried to concentrate on the words in front of me, something prevented me from relaxing completely. I still felt that persistent sense of unease, as if the house was still whispering to me, trying to alert me to something. Then I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were much closer and louder, as if someone was descending the stairs behind me. The sound resonated through the house, each beat echoing in my ears and accelerating my heart. The book fell from my hands and my body froze, unable to move for a few seconds. The idea that something or someone was really there, with me, became impossible to ignore. Slowly, I stood up from the couch, my mind racing with frightening possibilities. Whatever was happening seemed to be approaching, and I needed to find out what it was. Fear took root in me, but at the same time, a need to understand, to see with my own eyes what was causing those sounds. I took a few hesitant steps towards the stairs, each movement loaded with a mix of fear and determination. I knew I needed to investigate again, but this time, something inside me said that the situation had changed. The footsteps were now clear and undeniable, as if the house itself was conspiring to confront me with something I didn't want to see. But even with the growing fear, I couldn't stay still. I needed to discover the truth, even if it meant facing something much scarier than I had imagined. With my heart pounding, I began to check each room on the downstairs floor, hoping to find something that would explain the disturbing sounds. Each room I entered seemed darker and quieter than before, as if the house was waiting for my reaction. I opened doors, turned on lights looking for anything out of place. But with each search, I found only emptiness and silence, as if the house was playing with me. The kitchen was immaculate, all the utensils in their places. The dining room, equally untouched, with the table still set from the dinner I had made earlier. I moved on to the small office, hoping perhaps to find an open window or some indication that someone had entered. However, everything was as I had left it. No sign that anything or anyone had passed through there. The living room, which I had just left, was also as before, except for the book I had dropped on the floor. I picked it up, trying to calm myself with the familiarity of the object in my hands. But even with everything seemingly normal, the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave me. It was as if I was being watched, as if something was lurking, just waiting to reveal itself. Each minute that passed, the tension increased, and the sensation of being hunted within my own home became more real. I knew I needed to do something, but the doubt about what was really happening left me paralyzed. I decided then to go back to the hallway, where the footsteps had been stronger, hoping to find some sign that I might have missed. But as I walked back to the hallway, a new sound caught my attention. It was different from the previous footsteps, more sudden and decisive. The sound of a door closing upstairs, with a loud snap that echoed through the house, making my blood run cold. I stood there, unable to move, as panic began to take hold of me. I knew I had to act, but the fear of discovering what was behind that door was almost unbearable. The sound of the door closing reverberated in my ears, bringing a wave of dread that left me paralyzed for a few moments. My body refused to move, as if an invisible force was holding me in place. The noise was not something I could ignore, as I knew that until then, all the doors in the house had been open. The conclusion was obvious and terrifying. Someone or something was upstairs. My first reaction was to run, to leave the house and seek help. Panic began to rise in my throat, and the desire to flee was nearly uncontrollable. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I tried to decide what to do. The idea of going back upstairs and confronting what was waiting filled me with terror. But at the same time, something inside me resisted the idea of abandoning my home. Each second seemed to stretch interminably as I struggled with my thoughts. I needed to stay calm. I needed to think rationally. But the sound of the door slamming still echoed in my mind, each heartbeat amplifying the fear. It was clear that I could not ignore what was happening. The situation had become much more serious than I could have imagined. I knew I couldn't leave the house without finding out what was happening upstairs. But what would I do if I actually found someone? The idea of confronting an unknown presence terrified me, but at the same time, the need to protect my space and understand the truth was even stronger. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves as I made a decision. Finally, I gathered the courage I had left and began to walk towards the stairs. I knew that whatever was up there, I needed to face it. The fear was still paralyzing, but at the same time, the determination not to let the unknown dominate me was stronger. With each step I took towards the stairs, I felt the tension increase, but also the certainty that there was no turning back. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step increasing the weight on my shoulders. The silence that had taken over the house was oppressive, and each breath seemed a conscious effort. The flashlight in my hand trembled slightly as I tried to control my nerves. I was approaching the hallway where the door had slammed, and the idea that something was waiting for me there left me on the verge of panic. When I reached the top of the stairs, I looked down the hallway in front of me. The air seemed colder and the darkness was almost tangible, as if I could feel the weight of it against my skin. I walked slowly, each step echoing through the empty corridor, each shadow seeming to move with its own life. The door to the main bedroom was closed, which was strange, as I was sure I had left it open. I stopped in front of the door, feeling the presence of something on the other side. My breathing was rapid and shallow, and my hand hesitated as it reached for the doorknob. I knew I was on the brink of discovering something that would completely change my perception of what was happening. The fear of opening that door was almost overwhelming, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. With a decisive movement, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, and the flashlight revealed the bed, the curtains, and the furniture, all in the same place as before. However, something caught my attention. The closet was slightly ajar, something I was sure hadn't been the case before. The sight of a shadow inside the closet made my heart race, and a wave of terror washed over me. With short, gasping breaths, I approached the closet, each step making my heart beat louder. The flashlight trembled as I neared, knowing I was about to discover what was hidden there. My trembling hand reached for the closet door, and with one last breath I pulled it open, revealing what was hidden in the shadows. When I opened the closet door, my heart stopped for a moment. Inside, crouched among the clothes, was a man. His eyes shone in the darkness, fixed on me with an intensity that paralyzed me. He didn't move, didn't speak, just continued to watch me in complete silence. The shock of seeing him there, so close and so still, left me speechless, unable to process what was happening. The man seemed to be in an almost animal state, as if he was on the brink of something unpredictable. His eyes never left mine, and the air around seemed to carry a tension so heavy it was hard to breathe. My mind raced, trying to understand how he had entered the house, what he wanted, and how I could get out of this situation unscathed. But the only clear thing was the overwhelming fear I felt. Slowly I began to back away, never taking my eyes off him. Each movement I made was careful, measured, not to provoke any reaction from him. The dread enveloped me, but I knew I needed to stay calm, I needed to get out of that room before he did something. He continued to watch me, the silence between us becoming ever more unbearable, as if he was waiting for something. With my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears, I managed to take a few steps back, trying to reach the bedroom door. Each step, the fear that he would move, that he would do something unexpected, was paralyzing. But he stayed where he was, his eyes never leaving mine, as if he was analyzing every move I made. Finally, I reached the door, and without taking my eyes off him, managed to exit the room, closing the door behind me. The sense of relief was immediate, but the terror was still present. I knew I needed to get out of the house, to seek help, but my legs felt weak and my mind was in complete chaos. As soon as I closed the bedroom door, the survival instinct finally took over. I ran down the hallway, descending the stairs as quickly as I could, feeling the panic take control of every movement. The house, which had once been my refuge, now seemed like a suffocating maze from which I needed to escape. Every sound I heard seemed amplified, as if he was following me, but I dared not look back. I reached the front door with trembling hands, struggling to turn the key in the lock. The fear that he would appear at any moment made me act faster than I ever had before. Finally, I managed to open the door and ran out into the garden, feeling the cool night air against my face. I didn't care about the rain that was falling, nor about the darkness outside. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between myself and that house. Once outside, I reached for my trembling cell phone and dialed the police, barely able to form coherent words as I tried to explain what had happened. I managed to tell them where I was, that there was someone in my house, and I pleaded for them to come quickly. The lights of the house still shone in the distance, but they were now just a backdrop of terror that I never wanted to revisit. The wait for the police felt eternal, but finally, the red and blue lights cut through the darkness, bringing a sense of relief mixed with lingering fear. The officers entered the house cautiously, armed and prepared for whatever awaited them. I stayed outside, shivering from both cold and fear, trying to process what I had just experienced. After what seemed like an eternity, the officers returned. They found no one inside the house. They searched every room, checked the closet, and all possible entries, but there was no sign of the man I had seen. They said it could have been an intruder who fled, or perhaps the result of stress and suggestion. But I knew what I had seen. Even if he was no longer there, the feeling of his eyes watching me would stay with me, and the uncertainty about what really happened that night would haunt me forever. My name is Sarah, and that night I was alone at home, enjoying the silence and tranquility that solitude provided. I was sitting on the living room sofa, binge-watching a thriller series that had gripped me from the first episode. The house was quiet, the only sound being the tense dialogue from the series and the occasional creak of the house's structure, something common in older buildings. I was relaxed, lost in the engaging plot, when something unexpected caught my attention. While adjusting my position on the sofa, about to start another episode, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that one of the kitchen windows was open. This surprised me, as I have a habit of keeping all the windows in the house closed, especially at night. A feeling of discomfort began to form, but I quickly dismissed it, convinced that I might have forgotten to close it after opening it earlier to air out the kitchen. I got up and went to the kitchen, still enveloped in the tense atmosphere of the series, and closed the window, locking it carefully. The night was clear, the moonlight illuminating the garden and the street in front of the house. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary outside, just the typical calm of a residential neighborhood. I tried to convince myself that there was no reason to worry. I closed the window with a firm click and returned to the living room, determined to continue my series marathon. However, deep down, a slight discomfort persisted, as if something was out of place. I returned to the sofa, but now the atmosphere of the house seemed different. The silence, which before was a comfortable refuge, now felt heavy, almost suffocating. The series continued on the screen, but my mind was distracted, repeatedly going back to the window. Had I really left it open? Or was there something more? I tried to dismiss these doubts, focusing on the suspense scenes on TV, but the restlessness was hard to ignore. While I tried to refocus on the series, my thoughts continued to drift to the window. Why would I have left it open? I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that the suspense of the series was affecting my imagination, but the feeling that something was out of place persisted, growing like a dark premonition. I decided to ignore this discomfort and continue watching, hoping the feeling would go away. However, that subtle restlessness continued to grow within me, like a storm about to form. Shortly after closing the window, I returned to the sofa, trying to regain the calm I had before. The series continued, but I couldn't get as involved as before. The silence of the house, once a refuge, now seemed to hide something. I tried to dismiss these thoughts, convincing myself that everything was normal, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me in peace. Then I heard a noise from outside, something I couldn't immediately identify. It sounded like a soft scratching, as if something was moving near the house. My heart sped up, and for a moment I sat motionless, trying to figure out what it could be. Was it just an animal? Or perhaps the wind? I couldn't prevent fear from starting to set in again. I got up slowly, my body tense with anticipation of what I might find. As I approached the kitchen, the sight of the window open again nearly stopped my heart. I was sure I had closed and locked it a short while before. The idea that the window could open by itself seemed impossible, but there it was, wide open, letting in the cold night air. A chill ran down my spine as I approached the open window, trying to control the fear that was beginning to dominate me. I closed it again, this time with a bit more force, making sure the latch was securely in place. I looked outside again, but saw nothing unusual. Even so, the feeling that something was wrong was intensifying. I returned to the living room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The suspenseful climate of the series now seemed like a premonition, as if something was about to happen. I sat down on the sofa, but now, the tranquility of the house had disappeared, replaced by a growing anxiety that I couldn't control. What was going on with the window? Was I imagining things? Or was there really something wrong that night? With the discomfort growing inside me, I decided that I needed to do something to feel more secure. The idea that the window could have opened again on its own made me nervous, so I decided to check the entire house. I started with the living room, making sure that the doors and windows were locked. The silence around me seemed heavier now, as if the house was holding its breath along with me. I went through the kitchen again, checking the window I had just locked. Everything seemed in order, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I went to the bedrooms, checking that all the windows were securely closed. Each door I opened seemed to reveal only emptiness and darkness, but the feeling that something was wrong continued to haunt me. As I walked through the house, the sound of my steps echoed through the corridors, increasing the sense of loneliness. The house, which had once seemed a refuge, now seemed full of shadows and secrets. Every small creak, every muffled sound, made my heart jump in my chest. I locked the last window and the back door, making sure that nothing could enter. Despite this, the feeling of safety didn't come. I returned to the living room trying to calm down, but now the series on TV seemed like just background noise, something distant and irrelevant. The suspenseful atmosphere that had so attracted me on the screen now seemed to be infiltrating my own life. I sat down on the sofa again, but the feeling of restlessness was almost unbearable. Even with all the windows and doors locked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to convince myself that I was being irrational, that the series I was watching had stirred up my mind too much. But deep down, I knew that the restlessness wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something was not right that night, and no matter how much I tried to calm down, the feeling of discomfort persisted, as if an invisible danger was lurking, waiting to reveal itself. After locking all the doors and windows, I returned to the sofa, but trying to resume my series marathon was futile. My mind was restless, and the silence around me seemed deeper, almost oppressive. The feeling of being watched was constant, and no matter how much I tried to focus on the TV, I couldn't shake off the fear that had set in. It was then that I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. The sound of soft steps coming from the garden right behind the house put me on immediate alert. I jumped up and went to the living room window to look outside. The darkness of the garden was almost impenetrable, but the steps continued, as if someone were walking there, lurking. I looked carefully, trying to discern any movement, but saw nothing. However, the sound persisted, and the anxiety within me grew. My hands began to tremble as I tried to understand what was happening. The noise was real. It wasn't a product of my imagination. But who could be walking in the garden at that hour? The idea filled me with dread. I looked again through the window, hoping to see some sign of movement, but the night remained quiet, as if it were hiding something. Every sound seemed amplified by the silence. Every crack of the plants, every subtle movement in the darkness made my heart beat faster. There was no doubt someone was out there, but the absence of any visible figure only made everything scarier. I felt like prey trapped, waiting for the predator I knew was nearby but couldn't see. With fear taking over, I knew I had to do something. The sensation of imminent danger was overwhelming, and I knew I couldn't just sit there waiting for something to happen. I grabbed the phone with trembling hands, determined to ask for help. The situation was out of control, and my only hope was that the police could arrive in time to prevent the worst. With the phone in my hands, I quickly dialed the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what was happening. I reported the events, from the insistently opening window to the steps in the garden. Each word I said seemed to highlight the fear within me, making the situation even more terrifying. The person on the other end of the line tried to calm me down, saying they would send a patrol car immediately. However, panic had already set in. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The silence of the house was oppressive, and every minute that passed felt like an eternity. My eyes didn't leave the window, waiting to see some sign of the intruder. My mind was spinning in circles, creating scenarios of what might be lurking outside. The tension was almost unbearable. It was then that I heard a loud noise from upstairs, like something heavy had fallen. The sound reverberated through the house, and my heart stopped for a moment. The possibility that someone was inside the house paralyzed me with fear. I gripped the phone tightly, trying to decide what to do. The idea of going up and investigating terrified me, but the alternative of staying downstairs, not knowing what was happening, was equally terrifying. With the police on the way, I knew I needed to buy time until they arrived, but the tension was unbearable. The noise upstairs indicated that the danger was closer than I had imagined, and each passing second increased the terror. The feeling that time was running out impelled me to act, but the fear of confronting the unknown was paralyzing. Finally, I gathered the little courage I had left and began to move towards the stairs. Each step I took seemed to echo through the house, as if the building itself were aware of the terror I felt. The sound of my breathing was the only noise besides my racing heart. Climbing those stairs felt like the hardest thing I had ever done, but I knew I had no choice. Something was happening upstairs, and I needed to find out what it was. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step increasing the sense of dread that had already taken hold of me. The house was enveloped in deep silence, and the darkness of the upper floor seemed denser, almost oppressive. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and each step I took seemed like an endless echo. I knew I was about to confront something I didn't understand, and the fear was almost unbearable. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated for a moment, trying to calm my nerves before continuing. The corridor in front of me was shrouded in shadows, and each closed door seemed to hold a dark secret. The sound I had heard earlier still echoed in my mind, and the possibility of finding someone upstairs made my stomach churn. With short, gasping breaths, I decided to start with the master bedroom, where the sense of danger seemed strongest. I opened the bedroom door slowly with trembling hands, and was greeted by a sight that made my blood run cold. The bedroom window was open, the curtains swaying gently with the breeze. And there, in the middle of the room, was a man. He was facing away from me, looking desperate, as if he were trying to escape. The sight of him there, so close and inside my house, froze me for a moment. The man did not seem to notice my presence yet, and each second that passed felt like an eternity. The initial shock was quickly replaced by a paralyzing fear. He was invading my space, my home, and the realization that I was in real danger took over me. I felt my body react, driven by survival instinct. I knew I had to act quickly. As soon as I saw the man in the room, my heart stopped for a moment. He was there, with his back to me, apparently trying to escape through the window. The shock of the sight paralyzed me for a moment, but the survival instinct quickly took over. I backed away quietly, without making noise, keeping my eyes on him as I returned to the corridor. I didn't want to draw his attention, knowing I needed to get out of there without alerting him. I retreated down the corridor, my hands trembling, my body in a state of complete alert. I saw an open door further ahead and knew I needed to hide. Without making noise, I slipped into the room and closed the door behind me, turning the key in the lock with trembling hands. The click of the lock seemed to echo in the silence, and my heart raced even more. The sound, though small, seemed so loud I feared I had alerted the intruder. For a moment, silence reigned. I could barely breathe, desperately trying to control the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. It was then that I heard his steps in the corridor, each one closer than the last. He had heard the sound of the door locking, and was now heading in my direction. The idea that he knew where I was sent me into a panic, and my mind raced to find a solution. The steps outside got closer, and then stopped right in front of the door where I was hiding. I held my breath, expecting the worst. The silence was deafening, and I knew he was listening, trying to discern any movement or sound inside the room. My mind was in complete chaos, trying to think of how I could escape this situation. Then, without warning, he began to force the door, trying to open it with all his might. The sound of the wood straining under the pressure was like a blow to my nerves. I knew the door wouldn't hold for long. Locked inside the room, I felt completely vulnerable, the dread increasing with each blow. I knew the police were on their way, but the fear that they wouldn't arrive in time was overwhelming. I was alone, cornered, and the only thing keeping me going was the hope that they would arrive before he managed to break in. Locked inside the room, each second felt like an eternity as the blows to the door intensified. The sound of the wood creaking and giving way under the intruder's force was deafening, and my heart beat so hard I thought he could hear it from outside. The fear had completely taken over me, and the only thing I could do was wait, praying that the police would arrive in time. The blows continued, and the door was about to give way. The idea of facing the intruder face to face was paralyzing. I knew that once he got in, there would be no way to escape. The closet was my last protection, but I knew it wouldn't last long. I was completely cornered, and the sound of the intruder outside was the only thing filling the oppressive silence of the room. I held the phone with trembling hands, ready to call the police again. My voice was weak and shaky, but I knew I had to try. Before I could dial, I heard a distant sound that gave me a thread of hope. Sirens. The police were approaching. The idea that help was on the way gave me a small spark of courage, but the fear was still overwhelming. The sound of the sirens approaching seemed to enrage the intruder, who increased the intensity of his blows to the door. Each bang sounded like thunder. Each second that passed was an eternity. The desperation on his side was palpable, and I knew he was getting more and more desperate. But the sound of the sirens was getting louder, and that gave me a new hope that the situation might be resolved before he managed to break in. Finally, I heard rapid footsteps outside the room, followed by authoritative voices. The police had arrived. The blows to the door stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was so profound I could hardly breathe. After a moment that seemed like an eternity, I heard the sound of the front door being opened and the police entering the house. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, knowing I was finally safe. But the terror I felt that night would never be forgotten. Even with the arrival of the police and the apparent safety, my mind couldn't stop spinning with questions that would probably never have answers. Who was that man? How had he gotten into my house? The fear was replaced by a deep unease, and doubt set in, turning every small sound in the house into a reminder that, despite the danger having passed, the feeling of vulnerability and unanswered questions would continue to haunt me for a long time. My name is Andrew, and that night I was alone at home, enjoying the tranquility after a long day of work. The quietness was almost relaxing, and I planned to spend the evening without major concerns. Then, the security alarm abruptly went off, breaking the silence with its piercing sound. The noise was so unexpected that I jumped off the couch, my heart racing with shock. I ran towards the alarm control panel, trying to understand what was happening. At the panel, I saw that the motion detection had been activated on the lower floor. My heart raced even faster as I processed the information. I knew something wasn't right, and the tranquility of the night had been shattered. I looked around, searching for any sign of movement, but everything seemed in place. The thought of someone possibly being inside the house with me was terrifying, but I knew I had to act. I grabbed a weapon I kept for emergencies, a measure I never thought I'd actually need to use. I felt its weight in my hands, a constant reminder of the gravity of the situation. Holding the weapon, I tried to calm my breathing, focusing on what needed to be done. I couldn't just ignore the alarm, so I made the decision to go downstairs and check out what was happening. The fear was palpable, but I knew I had no choice. I descended the stairs cautiously, each step calculated and silent. The house, which was once a place of comfort, now seemed full of threatening shadows. Every little noise, however minor, made my heart jump in my chest. The weapon in my hands was the only thing that gave me some sense of security, but the fear of encountering an intruder was overwhelming. I moved slowly, trying to hear any sound that might indicate someone's presence. When I finally reached the lower floor, silence reigned again. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, and I knew I needed to stay calm. I went through each room, checking the doors and windows. Everything seemed in order, locked as it should be. There were no signs of intruders, and the alarm gave no further signs of activity. Confused, I restarted the system, hoping it had just been a technical error. With the alarm reset, I tried to convince myself that everything was under control. I went back upstairs, feeling the adrenaline begin to subside, but the restlessness persisted. I returned to the upper floor, trying to regain the sense of security I had before. However, the silence of the house, which was once reassuring, now seemed charged with tension. My body was still on alert, my ears keen to any out-of-the-ordinary sounds. I sat down on the couch trying to calm down, but my thoughts continued to focus on what had happened. The alarm going off without any apparent reason was not something I could simply ignore. Even so, I tried to convince myself that it might have been a simple misunderstanding, a fault in the system. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to recover my calm, but a part of me knew that the tranquility of the night had been irreversibly broken. Shortly after, the alarm went off again, interrupting my thoughts. This time, the motion detection indicated activity in the kitchen. A chill ran down my spine as the shrill sound filled the house once more. Panic began to take over me, and the idea that someone might actually be inside the house became impossible to ignore. The fear I had been trying to suppress was now uncontrollable. I got up from the couch, the weapon still firm in my hands, and went down the stairs again. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the tension in my body was palpable. The idea of confronting an intruder in the kitchen was terrifying, but I knew I had to act. The alarm continued to sound, a constant reminder that something was very wrong. With each passing second, the fear of discovering the truth grew inside me. I reached the kitchen, feeling the weight of the moment. The light was on, but the space seemed darker than ever. I checked all the doors and windows, hoping to find something out of place, but everything was locked. The feeling that something was wrong was overwhelming, and I knew I couldn't just ignore what was happening. I needed to find the source of the problem, but the fear of encountering the unexpected left me paralyzed. As I walked through the kitchen, trying to understand what was going on, something caught my attention. On the floor near the door, there were wet footprints. They were small, but visible, and seemed to have been made recently. A shiver ran down my spine as I tried to figure out where they had come from. The footprints led towards the hallway, but disappeared before I could follow the trail. Panic began to take over me again. The footprints were proof that someone was there, but I couldn't understand how or why. The house was locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. The idea that someone might be hiding somewhere terrified me. I needed to find out who it was, but the fear of facing the unknown left me paralyzed for a moment. The wet footprints on the floor were undeniable evidence that something was very wrong. My heart raced as I tried to understand what was happening. The idea that someone had been there, so close without me noticing, terrified me. I looked around, trying to find more clues, but the footprints mysteriously disappeared in the hallway. I felt increasingly vulnerable, as if I were being hunted in my own home. Arriving in the kitchen, the sense of despair overwhelmed me. The wet footprints on the floor were still there, but now they seemed more sinister. I looked around, trying to find any sign of the intruder, but everything seemed in order. The idea that he could be hiding somewhere in the house left me even more terrified. I knew I couldn't stay there, but all the exits seemed blocked. As I tried to decide what to do, I heard the steps again, this time louder, as if the intruder was walking directly towards me. My entire body tensed with fear, the weapon firm in my hands, ready to shoot at any moment. The sound of the steps echoed through the kitchen, getting closer and closer, and I knew I was about to face something I couldn't avoid. As I tried to process what I was seeing, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. They were steps, soft but unmistakable, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned quickly, weapon in hand, but saw no one. The silence that followed was deafening, and my heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The feeling of being watched was intense, and the fear that someone might be lurking left me paralyzed. I decided I needed to get out of there, but the fear of turning my back on the danger was overwhelming. Each step I took was accompanied by a sense of dread, as if at any moment someone could emerge from the shadows. The sound of the steps still echoed in my mind, and the idea that someone was playing with me left me increasingly terrified. I knew I needed to make a decision quickly, before it was too late. At that moment, the alarm went off again. With the alarm echoing through the house, I tried to focus on what needed to be done. I needed to find out where the steps had come from, but the fear of facing the unknown left me paralyzed. The feeling of being watched was intense, and each shadow seemed to hide an invisible danger. I knew I couldn't stay there, but the terror of finding what was hidden prevented me from acting. Finally, I gathered the courage and started moving towards the front door. The plan was simple: get out of the house and ask for help. But as I approached the door, the fear increased. I knew the danger was closer than ever, and the idea that someone could be inside the house with me was unbearable. Yet I knew I had no choice. I needed to get out of there, no matter what it cost. I ran towards the front door, hoping to find refuge from whatever was haunting me within those four walls. But when I tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The doorknob was rigid, as if the door was locked from the outside. Desperation took over me as I realized I was trapped inside my own house. I forced the door again, using all my strength, but it didn't move. It was as if an invisible force was keeping it closed, preventing my escape. Panic overwhelmed me, and the feeling of being cornered was unbearable. I turned, trying to find another exit, but I knew the windows were locked and the back doors had already been checked. I was trapped, with no way out, and the fear of facing whatever was coming was crushing. The sound of steps returned, now closer, as if the intruder was approaching me. I turned quickly, weapon in hand, but again saw no one. The terror I felt at that moment was indescribable. I was alone, trapped, and certain that the danger was getting closer. The sound of the steps was like a clock, counting down the time I had left before something terrible happened. My mind raced to find solutions, but the panic made clear thinking difficult. I knew I needed to find a way out, but all escape routes seemed blocked. The sound of steps continued, louder and louder, and the feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. I felt like I was in a deadly game, where the intruder was always one step ahead. With my heart racing, I decided to go back to the kitchen. It was the only place where I had seen evidence of the intruder, and maybe there was a clue I had missed before. The dread accompanied me every step of the way, and the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I knew time was running out, and I needed to act before it was too late. I looked around desperately, trying to find somewhere to hide or something that might give me an advantage. That's when I noticed something odd in one of the cabinets. The door was slightly ajar, something I hadn't noticed before. My heart raced. and a wave of dread washed over me as I thought the intruder might be hiding there, watching my every move. With trembling hands, I slowly approached the cabinet. Each step felt like a monumental effort, and the sound of my own movements was deafening. When I got close enough, I reached for the cabinet door, holding my breath as I prepared for whatever was inside. I knew this moment could decide everything, and the dread of discovering the truth was overwhelming. Finally, with a quick motion, I opened the cabinet door. What I saw inside made me freeze in fear. A man with a wild expression on his face was hiding there, ready to attack. Before I could react, he lunged at me, and the force of the impact threw me backward. The struggle began, and I knew I was fighting for my life. The impact of the attack was brutal, and I felt my body slam against the floor with force. The man was on top of me, trying to pin me down, while I desperately struggled to free myself. His strength was impressive, and for a moment, I thought I wouldn't be able to break free. But the survival instinct took over, and I used all my strength to push him back. I managed to disentangle myself for a moment and rolled away, trying to reach the weapon that had fallen to the floor. The man got up quickly, his expression of rage making it clear he wasn't going to give up easily. The terror I felt was paralyzing, but I knew I couldn't let fear control me. I needed to fight. I needed to survive. I reached for the weapon, knowing it was my only chance. The man charged again, and I grabbed the weapon at the last second. I pointed it at him, my finger trembling on the trigger as he stopped, his eyes fixed on me. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. He stood still, assessing the situation, while I struggled to control my breathing. The tension was palpable, and I knew any wrong move could be the end for me. Finally, he raised his hands, giving up the fight. The expression on his face shifted from rage to something more calculated, as if he was reconsidering his options. But I didn't lower the weapon, keeping it steady, ready to shoot if he tried anything. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by a fierce determination to survive. I couldn't let him win. At that moment, I heard the sound of police sirens in the distance. The relief I felt was immediate, but I kept the weapon aimed at him, not taking my eyes off him. I knew the police were on their way and that I would finally be safe. The man seemed to realize this too, and his expression changed to a mix of frustration and resignation. He had no way out, and I knew the fight had finally ended. The police entered the house quickly, their voices firm as they echoed through the corridors. I heard them approaching and finally lowered the weapon when one of the officers entered the kitchen, weapon drawn. I quickly explained what had happened, while they handcuffed the intruder and took him outside. The man, now in custody, was led away, but the fear and tension I had felt that night were still present. Even after the intruder was taken away by the police, I sat in the kitchen, still in shock from what had happened. The officers assured me that I was safe now, but the idea that someone had invaded my home, waiting to attack me, was hard to process. My home, which was once a safe haven, now seemed like a place full of unseen threats. The sense of security I had was shattered, and I knew it would take a long time to recover from this event. One of the officers told me that the man they had arrested had a history of dangerous behavior, and that I had been lucky to defend myself. But the questions that remained in my mind were disturbing. How had he gotten in without me noticing? What did he really want? And most importantly, how could I ensure that this would never happen again? These questions haunted my thoughts, and the idea that he had chosen my house, out of all others, made me uneasy. Finally, after all the police had left, I was alone again. But the feeling of safety was never the same. I knew what had happened that night would change me forever. The terror, the fight for survival, and the unanswered questions would leave an indelible mark on me. All I wanted now was to find a way to regain peace of mind, but I knew that would be much harder than simply locking the doors. My name is Rachel, and that night, everything seemed absolutely normal. I was alone at home, enjoying the silence that I've always found comforting. Sitting on the couch, I tried to disconnect from the hectic day, letting my mind wander as I observed the calm around me. The house was enveloped in a cozy silence, the kind of silence that usually relaxes me and makes me feel safe. But suddenly, an unexpected sound broke that tranquility. Soft knocks on the front door. The sound was so light that at first I thought it was my imagination or maybe the wind. Little did I know that this peaceful night was about to turn into something much more disturbing. Curious, I got up and walked to the door, trying to listen more carefully. The knocking continued, regular and insistent, and it began to make me uneasy. When I reached the door, I peered through the peephole, expecting to see someone outside. However, there was no one there. The street was deserted, lit only by the dim streetlights, and the emptiness outside sent a chill down my spine. I stood there motionless, trying to understand what was happening. For a few seconds, the knocking stopped, and silence once again dominated the house. I returned to the couch trying to ignore what had just happened. Maybe it was just the wind, or some animal moving near the door. However, the feeling that something was wrong began to take root in me. The silence that had once been comforting now felt oppressive, as if the house was waiting for something. I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but my attention was divided. The sound of the knocking still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked again at the door, expecting the knocking to start again, but everything was quiet. The television continued to show images that I could barely register as my mind filled with unanswered questions. As the minutes passed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Perhaps it was just a mistake or a bad joke. But deep down, a part of me knew it wasn't that simple. Whatever it was, I knew I wouldn't be able to forget it easily. The tranquility of the night had been shattered, and the sense of security I had in my own home now felt fragile and distant. After a few minutes of trying to convince myself that the knocking meant nothing, I began to hear a new sound that made me even more uneasy. This time, it was footsteps. Soft, but clearly audible footsteps, as if someone was walking around the house. I felt my heart race as I tried to locate the source of the sounds. It seemed like the person was circling the house, going from one side to the other. I got up from the couch and started to walk quietly around the house, trying to hear better. The footsteps seemed to come from all directions, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. The tension inside me grew, and I knew I was not alone. My instincts told me that someone was out there, someone who wasn't there by accident. I felt as if I was being hunted, but I couldn't see who or what it was. I looked out the window, hoping to see something, but all I saw was darkness. The garden was calm, with no signs of movement. The street remained deserted, with no clues as to the origin of the footsteps. Yet, they continued, moving around the perimeter of the house, and my anxiety only increased. Whoever it was, they were making sure there were no blind spots, and that terrified me. Panic began to take hold of me, but I knew I needed to stay calm. My first impulse was to make sure all the doors and windows were locked. I knew that if someone wanted to get in, they would need an opening, and I wasn't about to give them that chance. I quickly moved through the rooms, checking the locks and trying to keep control over the growing fear I felt. Despite my quick actions, the footsteps continued, as if they were following me from outside the house. Each step I took inside seemed to echo with a response from outside. The tension in the night was palpable, and the sound of the footsteps became a constant, threatening presence that I couldn't shake. Something was very wrong, and I felt that the worst was yet to come. As I moved through the house, checking the doors and windows, the knocking started again. This time it didn't come from the front door, but from the back door. The sound was stronger, more insistent, as if the person outside was trying to get in at all costs. My heart raced, and a sense of panic began to set in. There was no doubt now. Someone was trying to break into my house. The idea that someone was at the back door, so close to the kitchen where I was, left me paralyzed. The sound of the knocking was relentless, echoing down the hallway and in my mind. I felt a chill run down my spine as I tried to decide what to do. Going back to the living room seemed impossible, and confronting whoever was outside was out of the question. I was cornered and terrified, with a growing sense that time was running out. The knocking continued, growing louder, as if the intruder knew I was inside and wasn't planning to leave anytime soon. I felt my body tremble, the fear consuming me with each knock that echoed through the house. I knew I needed to do something before they tried to force their way in. The dread of being caught off guard prevented me from thinking clearly, but one thing was certain: I couldn't stay there, defenseless. I took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, began to move away from the kitchen towards the phone. I needed to call for help, and quickly. As I moved, the knocking on the back door changed rhythm, as if the intruder had sensed my presence. The idea that they knew I was there, so close, made me quicken my pace. The sound of my own movements in the house now seemed deafening, each step echoing in my already terrified mind. I reached the phone, feeling a rising panic. With the phone in my hands, I quickly dialed the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what was happening. I recounted the events, from the knocking on the front door to the footsteps around the house, and the insistent knocking on the back door. Every word I said seemed to amplify the fear inside me, making the situation even more terrifying. The operator listened to my shaky voice and tried to calm me down, promising that a patrol car would be sent immediately. As I waited for the police to arrive, the sense of vulnerability grew. The silence that followed the call was even more frightening. I stood still, clutching the phone tightly, trying to decide what to do next. My mind was on high alert, picking up on every little sound around me. The fear that the intruder might break in at any moment was paralyzing. With my heart racing, I began to move through the house, making sure all the doors and windows were locked. I knew the police were on their way, but I couldn't shake the panic I felt. Every second seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the tension in my mind only increased. I tried to focus on my breathing, but it was hard to stay calm when I knew someone was outside, trying to get in. The silence became more and more oppressive, and my mind started to create terrifying scenarios. What if the police didn't arrive in time? What if the intruder found a way in before they did? These questions haunted my thoughts, and the wait seemed interminable. The feeling that I was being hunted intensified with every passing minute, and I knew I needed to be prepared for anything. As the police still hadn't arrived, the knocking on the back door started again, this time with more force. My breathing became labored, and the terror I felt was almost tangible. I knew the situation was becoming critical, and the sound of the knocks, now stronger and more insistent, echoed in my mind like a harbinger of what was to come. The intruder wasn't just trying to break in. They were terrorizing me, and the fear that something horrible might happen became more real with every passing second. The knocking on the back door continued, growing more intense, and I could barely breathe from fear. Then, amid the insistent sound, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice whispering my name from outside. The whisper was low, but it carried a disturbing familiarity. Fear turned to panic, and the feeling of being in imminent danger became even clearer. Whoever was outside knew who I was. The voice repeated my name, and I felt my body freeze. Old memories, long buried, began to resurface. I couldn't believe this was happening. The familiarity of the voice brought forth a deep fear, something I had tried to forget. The idea that someone from my past was out there, trying to terrorize me, left me in a state of shock. As the voice continued to whisper, I tried to focus on anything that could get me out of that situation. My mind was in complete chaos, trying to process what was happening. The fear was overwhelming, and with each repetition of my name, I felt my heart beat faster. I knew I couldn't wait any longer, that I needed to act before it was too late. In a moment of desperation, I decided I couldn't just stand there waiting for the police to arrive. The feeling that time was running out made me act impulsively. I ran towards one of the windows, hoping to find a way out. But when I opened it, I was met with a sight that paralyzed me. A hooded man standing in the garden staring at me. His eyes, glowing in the darkness, made me feel as if I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. I quickly closed the window, panic taking hold of me. The possibility of escape seemed to have vanished, and the only thing left for me to do was to protect myself. I ran through the house, locking all the windows, trying to create a barrier between myself and the man outside. The feeling of being cornered grew with every passing second, and the fear that he would break in before the police arrived consumed me completely. As I locked the last window, I heard the intruder's footsteps getting closer. He was circling the house looking for a way in. The sound of his footsteps was constant, menacing, and I knew I was running out of time. Every beat of my heart felt like a reminder that the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. There was nowhere left to run, and the only thing I could do was hide and hope the police arrived in time. I found refuge in one of the bedrooms, locking the door behind me. I knew the door wasn't a strong defense, but it was all I had. The silence in the room was almost deafening, interrupted only by the intruder's footsteps outside. I knew he was trying to find a way in, and the sound of glass breaking echoed through the house, confirming my worst fear. He had found a weak spot. My entire body trembled with fear, and the feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. Panic kept me frozen, and I knew that if he managed to get in, there would be nowhere to run. The footsteps began to ascend the stairs, each step creaking under the intruder's weight. The house was enveloped in an oppressive silence, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, rapid and irregular. The feeling of being cornered intensified with every passing second, and I knew time was running out. He was getting closer and closer, and I had no way to stop him. The sound of the footsteps stopped right in front of the bedroom door where I was hiding. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I knew he was on the other side of the door, listening, waiting for the right moment to strike. The idea that he could break in at any moment paralyzed me, and I felt completely helpless. The terror I felt was indescribable, and all I could do was pray that the police would arrive in time. When he started to force the door, I knew there was no more time. The sound of the wood creaking under the pressure was like a direct hit to my nerves. The dread of being confronted by him, of being face to face with my stalker, was overwhelming. Fear kept me huddled in the corner of the room, trying to make myself as small as possible. I knew that if he managed to break in, I would be in mortal danger. Then I heard the sound I had been longing to hear. Sirens. The police were finally arriving. The sirens breaking through the night silence were an immediate relief, and for the first time in hours, I felt a glimmer of hope. The sound of the siren seemed to enrage the intruder, who began to force the door with more intensity. But I knew the police were close, and the terror I felt began to give way to a desperate hope that they would arrive in time to save me. The police arrived just in time to stop the intruder from getting in, and the sight of the red and blue lights flashing outside was an immediate relief. The police entered the house quickly, their firm, authoritative voices echoing through the corridors. The sound of quick footsteps and orders being given brought me a sense of security I hadn't felt in a long time. I heard the sounds of a struggle, and soon after, silence returned. I knew they had captured the intruder, but I was still too scared to leave the room. My body was frozen with fear, and relief was still far from reaching me completely. Finally, one of the officers knocked on the bedroom door and announced it was safe to come out. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and slowly opened it. The officers were there, their faces serious, but they offered me a reassuring smile. They led me to the living room, where I saw the intruder being handcuffed and taken outside. My heart was still racing, and my mind was trying to process what had just happened. Then one of the officers informed me that the man they had arrested was a stalker I had known years ago, someone I thought I had left behind. The revelation shocked me deeply, and the sense of security that the police's presence had brought was quickly replaced by a new wave of terror. The idea that he had been stalking me for so long, waiting for an opportunity to terrorize me, left me completely shaken. As the man was led to the patrol car, I felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief that he had been captured, and fear knowing that even with him in custody, the sense of security I had in my own home had been destroyed. The night had been long and terrifying, and I knew it would take a long time to feel safe again. The questions that lingered in my mind about how he had managed to get so close without me noticing would haunt me for a long time. Even with the intruder in custody and the police assuring my safety, my mind couldn't stop racing with questions that tormented me. How had he found my address after all these years? Had he been watching me for longer than I could imagine? And why had he chosen that particular night to terrorize me? The feeling that something was still to be revealed left me uneasy. Even knowing he was in custody, I couldn't shake the fear that somehow the danger was still lurking. The doubts haunted me, and the realization that my sense of security had been irrevocably destroyed made me question if I would ever be able to trust my own space again.